Our speaker tonight is Dr. Wayne Lewis. He's going to be talking about charter schools. Dr. Lewis is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. He obtained his PhD from North Carolina State University, championed charter schools in Kentucky based on his research in the Louisville and Fayette County Public Schools. He spoke to the Kentucky Legislature Interim Joint Education Committee, and I also have what you said. Mind if I say that? Mind if I quote you? His quote to the Kentucky Legislature was, "What happens to those children if we don't provide them, what happens to those children if we don't provide them with alternative options? We've gotten to the place where we are more interested in defending institutions that don't serve children well." He is a champion behind Senate Bill 8. Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin, is a champion for charter schools. I give you Dr. Wayne Lewis.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I've, since January, had the opportunity to work in the Kentucky Education Workforce and Development Cabinet. So I've been there since January, working with Secretary Al Heiner, where I serve as Executive Director of Education Programs. And it is an amazing opportunity that we have under Governor Bevin's leadership to do some things over the next couple of years. I am a native, actually, of New Orleans, Louisiana. I've been in Kentucky since 2009, but born and raised in the city of New Orleans. Left after college, went to college at Loyola University of New Orleans, went to Ohio, to do graduate work, and that's where I met my wife. Met my wife there and then moved her back down to New Orleans, and we both went into education. So I started my career in education as a public school teacher. In middle schools and in high schools, started initially in the New Orleans Public Schools, which at that time was the lowest performing school district in the state of Louisiana. Taught there for a little while and then moved to the St. Charles Parish Public Schools, which at that time was the highest performing district in the state of Louisiana. And so had the opportunity to teach in school districts that were less than 10 miles apart. Both were like night and day. And that was an amazing opportunity for me to be able to see the difference in those districts and differences in the opportunities that kids had. Not just to get a great education, but to get a great start on life. We taught in the New Orleans area until 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit, and then we subsequently relocated to Raleigh, North Carolina. So I taught in the Wake County Public Schools in Raleigh, and was there until 2009 when the University of Kentucky recruited me to come to Lexington. So now we live right outside of Lexington in Woodford County. My wife and I, now almost 13 years, and our little girl who is just about 15 months old. Yeah, so we're having a good time right now. I actually got interested in charter schools and in school choice in graduate school. Wasn't from my professional teaching career in K-12 schools. We actually had a charter school law in Louisiana before I left. I had no idea what a charter school was. I started studying charter schools because my graduate advisor at North Carolina State studied charter schools, Lance Fogarelli. So I started to learn about them, started to get interested in them, and been in that line of work ever since. To be perfectly honest with you, when I first started studying them, I studied them only from the perspective of a researcher and not as an advocate. But became an advocate over time for high-quality public charter schools as I learned what they could mean for kids. So that's just to give you a little bit of background. In terms of what our topic is tonight, I like to start first and foremost with the definition of charter schools. And I usually take it not for granted that anybody has any type of depth of understanding of what they are. To be truthful, the topic is a little bit more complicated than folks usually think it is. Charter school legislation gets pretty specific, and so we'll try to talk through some of that stuff. In talking to Eric, we thought we'd spend about the first 30 minutes, maybe not quite so long, talking, and then have about 15 minutes for conversation afterward. But let me tell you, I have absolutely no objections to you stopping me along the way and asking questions. And so if you want to stop me along and talk, we can do that as well. Does that work for everyone?
Sure.
All right, so charter schools are relatively independent or autonomous public schools. One of the most frequent questions that I get about charter schools from folks, even folks who have lots of expertise in education, is, well, what about the private charter schools? And the truth is, there's no such thing as a private charter school, because all charter schools are public schools. So then we get into the question, well, what exactly is a public school? And there's more to that question, I think, than folks would usually think is to it. So let's talk about that. First of all, to be a public school, it means that you're open to the public, right? It means you're not closed to any specific group of people. It means that kids that attend the school are not charged tuition, no tuition to attend a public school. It means that the schools are funded by tax dollars, usually some combination of federal, state, and local tax dollars. And it means through some type of accountability mechanism, the schools are held accountable to the public. Now, what that public accountability looks like is a little bit different, even with traditional public schools. And so I break that accountability conversation down into three different types of accountability. One, which is what we've seen most often in public schools, and that's accountability for inputs. In other words, ensuring that what goes into public schools in terms of resources, in terms of people, meets certain criteria. So the requirement that teachers have certain licensure or have certain degrees, have certain qualifications, that's inputs-based accountability. The second type of accountability would be performance accountability. And that's something we've heard a lot more of late, which is accountability for the outcomes, what we see with students. So we give a lot more standardized assessments now than we used to. And we hold schools accountable for how kids perform on those assessments. That's an outcomes or performance-based accountability. The third type of accountability is one that we don't talk about very often with public schools, but I believe is really important. And we'll talk about it quite a bit in reference to charter schools and school choice, and that is consumer accountability. And that's the accountability that parents, that families can exercise with public schools, or private schools for that matter, when they are dissatisfied with the quality of services that they're receiving. And it's not much different than the consumer accountability that we exercise with grocery stores. All right, so my family, we shop at the Kroger, which is pretty close to where we live. That's probably the prime reason why we shop there, but we're satisfied with what we're getting. If for some reason my wife made the decision that she didn't like the quality of meat anymore, or I didn't like the produce, or they stopped carrying lines that we don't like, then we'd be able to go back to the drawing board and say, well, yeah, Kroger's pretty close, but maybe we'll try something else. We'd stop spending our dollars at Kroger and we go spend them at another place. That would be us exercising consumer accountability. Well, the same thing works with schools, or it can work, I would say it ought to work with schools, and that if parents, if families, if kids are dissatisfied with the quality of education services that they're receiving, either because it's poor quality services or it's just not in line with what a family wants for their children, then I would suggest that parents, families ought to have the opportunity to make a different decision about where their kids attend school. That's consumer accountability. We don't talk about that a whole lot with traditional public schools, because with traditional public schools, most kids attend schools based on neighborhood boundaries. Right? So usually an elementary school, a middle school, or a high school has lines drawn on a map, and if you live in a particular area, then you know what school you're going to attend, and you don't get a whole lot of choice with respect to that. So charter schools, every single one of them meet those criteria. Charter schools are open to the public. Charter schools don't charge tuition to kids. Charter schools are funded by tax dollars, and charter schools are held accountable through some type of mechanism to the public, usually with a greater emphasis on performance accountability and consumer accountability. Yes, sir.
I have a question. You said they're federally funded. Isn't there guidelines, federal money's coming?
Yes, sir. The federal funds that charter schools receive, most of those federal funds, the same federal funds that traditional public schools receive. In addition to those funds, though, through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now the latest reauthorization, the Every Student Succeeds Act, there is a special charter schools program through which states and school districts can get funds. Charter schools can obtain funds. Yes. So all three, federal, state, and local dollars typically go to support charter schools and traditional public schools. Yes, sir.
Are there any charter schools in Northern Kentucky?
There are no charter schools in Kentucky.
Ah,
No charter schools in Kentucky. So there is not a charter school law in Kentucky. One of the things we've been trying to do as advocates of high quality public charter schools in Kentucky, at least for maybe the last 6, 7 years, maybe even beyond, is to pass legislation in the Kentucky General Assembly that would allow for the establishment of charter schools.
Is the KEA against this?
KEA is absolutely against it. They're probably the biggest opponent of charter schools. And we'll talk a little bit about the politics of it and why KEA is against it for sure before we're done. Great questions. Other questions? Okay, so why charter schools? Why go down this route? Why not be satisfied with what we're getting with traditional public schools? Well, beyond the obvious fact that traditional public schools, while they tend to serve relatively well the middle kid, the average, the typical kid, at the extremes of the spectrum on lots of different indicators, traditional public schools haven't served kids on those ends of those spectrums very well. The performance of groups of kids has not been what we'd like them to be. And so the obvious reason why we look to alternatives to traditional public schools is that we want schools that better serve all kids well. Beyond that, though, there's this idea with site-based management theory that decision-making and governance in schools is better when made closer to the ground than further away from the school. So a big part of understanding charter schools is that decision-making is at the local school level. In traditional public schools, that's typically not the case. While the principal of a school, and in Kentucky, the School-Based Decision-Making Council, has a significant amount of decision-making power, decision-making authority, there are lots of decisions that are made at the school district level. The idea behind charter schools and behind site-based management theory is that those decisions would be better made at the school level. And so with charter schools, you have a board that is appointed usually and empowered to make decisions for that school, rather than a school board that's distant from the school. Yes, sir.
How many is in a classroom in a charter school?
That's going to vary. The idea behind a charter school is that it's independent, it's autonomous, and so there are not a lot of things that I can tell you about charter schools across the board. I mean, truthfully though, it's like there are not a lot of things I could say about traditional public schools across the board, because one on one side of town could be different than another one on the other side of town, even in the same school district. Yes, ma'am.
You hear a lot about magnet schools in Ohio, and those are charter schools there. Is that kind of how this would, is this your vision?
So magnet schools and charter schools are different.
Right, I mean, I know that there's a specific focus in a magnet school, but is that kind of what you would, how you would lay this out?
Yeah, well, we have magnet schools in
Right.
Kentucky as well.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between a magnet school and a charter school centers on that independence, that autonomy piece. while a magnet school has a particular focus usually that attracts kids to it from across the district, charter schools usually have that too. Magnet schools are district-run schools. So the local school district still runs a magnet school, even though it has that specific focus. Charter school may have a specific focus, but it's not run by the local school district. It's autonomous. Yes, ma'am?
You say it's run by a board, where do people on that board come from?
So this is one of the things that varies with charter school legislation. We currently have charter schools in 42 states and the District of Columbia. And the specifics of charter school legislation varies a bit from state to state. In general, in terms of the boards that are at the local school level, those boards are usually appointed. So there's an initial appointment when a group applies for a charter, for who those board members are gonna be, and then that board continues to select members to fill seats as they're vacated.
Who appoints them?
Initially, whoever it is that's applying for the charter. So if you, me, and 2 or 3 of our friends were applying for a charter, applying to the state of Kentucky for a charter, whoever was authorized to give a charter, we would be responsible for making that initial appointment, and the appointment of those members would become a part of our application that's considered. Yes, sir.
Charter schools have taxing ability?
Do they have taxing ability? The actual school?
Yeah,
No,
like
sir.
like regular school districts do.
No, a charter school wouldn't be able to tax itself.
I mean, tax the people.
Wouldn't be able to tax, yeah, so the individual school wouldn't be able to tax the people. Yes, sir.
If you wanted to form a charter school in Kentucky, what would be your first step?
We have to pass legislation in the legislature that would allow us to be able to have one. That's the first thing we have to do. That's why we've been fighting so hard the last couple of years to do it.
Has there been any state senators or congressmen that have put forth legislation to try to get something passed?
Yes, sir. Every year, at least for the last 5 or 6 years. Every year. And
Who's the
last-
lead guy?
In the Senate, for the last couple of years, that legislation has been sponsored by Senator Mike Wilson from Bowling Green. And in the House, that legislation has been sponsored by Representative Brad Montel from Shelbyville. Yeah, charter schools is one of those issues in Kentucky where there is complete political polarization. So there is not one Democrat in the state of Kentucky, Senate or House, who's been willing to support a charter school.
Surprise, surprise.
So complete polarization. That is not necessarily the case across the country. What we tend to see is usually conservatives support charter schools, although not completely. You find even some conservatives that don't always support charter schools in, lots of times in rural districts, in smaller rural districts. And we can talk a little bit about why. Progressive Democrats have, especially as of late, have tended to be supportive of charter schools as well. Opponents of charter schools have been most Democrats, frankly. Teachers unions, and traditional civil rights organizations that are aligned with teachers unions. Yes, ma'am.
If we could get a charter, would we take over the facilities of an existing school, or do you have to build a school?
So that's one of the details of the legislation. So in the legislation that Senator Wilson filed this year, which passed the Senate, charter schools would be able to lease available space from traditional public schools or anywhere else. They don't actually get to use facilities without paying for them. But if there's available space that a traditional public school district is not using, then they would be obliged to lease that space to a charter school.
I don't guess you ever have one school with a charter school and a traditional on the same facility.
You do have that in some states. You do. It's not typical, but you do. I've seen examples in New York State and in Texas. Yes, sir.
So you're at UK, correct, in Lexington?
I'm technically at UK. I'm on loan from UK to the state for the next couple of years.
I was just wondering, because I'm assuming you're in the Department of Education at UK.
I'm in the College of Education, Department of Educational Leadership.
Do you have any friends there?
Do I have lots of friends at UK. You mean in the College of Education?
Exactly.
I have lots of friends. I don't have lots of friends who are supportive of charter schools and school choice.
I can tell you right now, I got a feeling, you got a lot of friends in this room.
I hope so. Yes, sir.
How are students selected to attend the charter school?
Yeah, really great question. So what happens in most cases is there are fewer seats available in charter schools than there are students who are applying. And so there's usually a lottery where students are selected. Now, depending on the state, there can be preference given to certain groups of students. So in Senator Wilson's bill, there was preference given to students who come from low-income families to receive free and reduced price lunch, and to students who are attending persistently low-achieving schools. That is because his bill was a pilot project bill, which was specifically aimed at closing achievement gaps in Lexington and in Louisville. In statewide bills, statewide legislation where you have charter schools, that's not typical. It's usually much more the case where it's a lottery, and preference might only be given for a kid if his or her brother is already attending there, or sister's already attending there, or if mom or dad is a teacher there.
So it's not based on academic ability?
No, sir. No, sir. That's one of the big differences as well between charter schools and what we see actually with a lot of our magnet schools in Kentucky, where admission is based on academic ability. Yes, sir, in the back.
Do you have any free with a curriculum, or do you have to follow the Common Core program?
Well, what typically happens with charter school legislation is the curriculum, because it's a public school, is the same curriculum as other public schools. And charter schools typically do have to participate in the same assessment and accountability system that other public schools have to participate in. Yes,
I
sir.
read a study where it said that homeschool got way higher grades than charter schools.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing that. I'm not saying it's not possible. One of the things that would make that kind of study to do, that it'd be difficult to do that type of study because it's not often that homeschool kids take all of the same assessments that public school kids take.
This was in a particular state, and I forget which one it was, out west. Might have been California, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not true, but it doesn't sound like it's surprising to me. Yes, sir. And then over here, I'm sorry, I didn't want to forget about you.
What's the chance of getting rid of Common Core?
Well, that's a little bit off of what I was going to talk about, but the chances of getting rid of Common Core in Kentucky this legislative session, probably pretty slim. Probably pretty slim.
That's the first thing we need to do. First step.
Well, I mean, that's a matter of opinion. I would say that there are two equally important issues. Yes, ma'am.
Are you gonna tell us why you think we should have charter schools?
I am. I absolutely am.
I think what the speaker's learning is this group loves to ask questions. So when he first said, I'll open it up to questions, I thought, oh my goodness, he doesn't know this group.
I don't mind it at all.
Okay.
I don't mind it at all. So I'll go back to where we started. The first piece on why charter schools are a good idea, why I believe charter schools are a good idea, was the site-based management theory piece that I gave. Having decision-making occur closer to the ground. The second is this exchange for autonomy exchange between autonomy and higher standards of accountability. So the theory behind charter schools is that you remove some of the strings that are attached, some of the rules that local school districts impose on schools. Remove some of those, give schools increased flexibility, increased freedom, and in exchange for that, you hold them to a higher standard in academic accountability. In states that have written really strong charter school laws, they've included what we call even automatic closure provisions, meaning in exchange for saying you have greater flexibility and freedom at the school level, if you don't perform to this level that we've said that you specified in your charter for 3 consecutive years, then you have no choice but to close. Right? So that is appealing to me. As somebody who personally holding people accountable for results, for performance, that appeals to me. And I think it's an area where we've been lacking with traditional public schools. And there are a few other reasons. One is the idea that competition improves the performance of schools, whether those would be traditional public schools or charter schools. And so no kid is ever assigned to attend a charter school. As I said before, in most cases there are fewer seats available than there are applications. So the only kids that are going to charter schools are kids whose parents who've decided, I want my kid to be there. That sets up a situation in a district, even if you only have a few charter schools, where schools are forced to compete for kids. Because schools only get funded based on the number of kids that are attending them. If there's a school district, and there are no charters, there are no other public school options in the district, they're the only show in town, they don't have to compete for those kids. And so the idea is that by having competition, everybody would have to raise their game. Then this is really fundamental for me, probably the most fundamental piece for me, is the belief that parents ought to have the ability to make school and program decisions for their kids. And not that school district administrators or state level administrators would make those decisions for parents on their own. I believe that I'm best suited to decide where my kid ought to go to school. And I don't think a superintendent or a school board knows better than me what's best for my kid. So that's kind of my case for why I think we should be doing more charter schools. Not only more charter schools, but I understand I can talk before we